to the Always in Pursuit podcast. My name is Aaron, and
Back at it.
we're back. It's been a couple weeks. It's funny how life gets busy and things come up, and you just don't podcast for a couple weeks. But we're back and joined, as always, with Megan
Good morning.
and Pastor Mark.
Good
Hey,
afternoon.
hey.
Afternoon. 1
Yeah,
p.m.
sure.
Afternoon.
It's
Right.
after lunch for us.
Yeah. If you have found us in the deep corners of the podcast verse and you're just checking us out, we are a church located in Mounds View, Minnesota, and we do this podcast as a supplement to our weekly messages on Sundays. But we also talk about a lot of other things as well. And yeah, it's fun times.
Yeah.
So, Mark, why don't you kind of catch us up? Tell us about Sunday.
Yeah.
About the message this last week.
Yeah, it's been a few weeks. But yeah, this weekend last week we started our Encounters with Jesus series. We looked at the story of Matthew.
Yeah.
And it's one of my favorite ones because he's the unlikely disciple. And I think a lot of times when you are looking at the disciple group, you can kind of like pick one out that's sort of like you. I think there's a lot of people that are like, yeah, I'm a James, or I'm a Peter, or I'm a, there's some of the other ones that people don't really like. No one's like, I'm a Thomas, like he gets a bad,
what
bad
if you're
rap,
like,
by the way.
oh, I'm totally Judas.
Yeah.
That's not a good one.
Well, I've told you about my fan fiction before that I want to write about Judas. Like if it had gone a different way and Jesus restoring him after the case, the way he restored Peter would have been like pretty epic.
Right.
But poor Thomas, like everybody had trouble believing. And here's Jesus standing in front of you and you're like, is this even real? I don't know. I need to touch. And they're like, he's like, okay, here you go. And everyone has to call him Doubting Thomas forever.
Yeah.
But like everyone was doubting. Like,
Yeah.
he was not the only person doubting.
Right. Yeah.
So I just always
the nickname sticks.
it's terrible, right?
Yeah. There's Thomas.
Well, it didn't stick to Peter. He's the one that betrayed Jesus, but we don't call him betraying Peter.
No,
because he was restored, and that went a different way.
Yeah.
I just feel like it would have happened with Judas if he hadn't done what he did. If he hadn't exited the scene when he did, he probably would have got restored just the same way as the rest of them who screwed up. It would have been a cool story.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's completely off topic. The reason I was excited to talk about Matthew is just because it's one of those stories that I think all of us are the unlikely disciple, whether we want to believe that or not, whether we see ourselves that way or not. I think all of us are people who bring a lot more sin to the party than we think. We look at everybody else and we think, well, there's a Matthew, but we look at ourselves and we think like, man, I'm not really Matthew. I'm probably more of a, one of these other disciples. I mean, it is kind of funny too that like Nathaniel's like right before he meets Jesus, like, can anything good come from God? He like disses Jesus, his hometown, all of his friends. Should we have had trash talking Nathaniel? Like, there's another one.
Throwing shade, Nathaniel.
Yeah. So we looking at this story, to me, it sums up the like where the rubber meets the road when it comes to Jesus's teaching, because we kind of talked a little bit about it in the sermon, but like Matthew gets added to the team midway through the beginning part of Jesus's ministry. He's missed some major moments already.
Yeah.
And you have to ask the question, why was this guy added to the team? And then what does Jesus immediately do right after he adds Matthew to the team? It's like to put his disciples in a position of actually having to like live out or practice the things that Jesus has been teaching, which is like really uncomfortable. Right. And I think there's something there that like, when it comes to following Jesus, we can either choose his way and choose the comfort level, or have a more comfortable way of getting to where he wants us to go when we choose to opt in and obey and move ourselves in the direction he wants us to go. Or he can just keep putting us in more and more awkward positions until finally we are in this you can just imagine the nightmare that this was for a Jewish boy grown up and now has started to follow Jesus. And, every time Jesus is like teaching them, hey, I want you to love your neighbor as yourself. And people are like, well, what's a neighbor? And how what am I like? They're trying to like create these lines of, of obedience and to follow the letter of the law, not the rule of the law. And, and so Jesus is like, okay, cool. Let's just practice.
Yeah.
I want you guys to be comfortable in a room full of people that will make you unclean.
Mm-hmm.
So like you'll have to go through purification rituals in order to go back to the temple. B, they're people you never would have associated with. C, you probably are in a little way. I wouldn't call it racist, but like
They did not like
yes,
tax collectors.
There
It was
some,
like Roman people and then tax collector.
yeah, like legit hatred.
Yeah.
Like they hated these guys.
Mm-hmm.
And not just that, the group of people that associated with them were all the rest of the outcasted people.
Right. So do you think, like, to use a basketball analogy, is this Jesus as the coach, like pulling the starters and then putting like the guy at the end of his bench in to play, like be like, hey, you guys need to like chill out and watch Matthew become a disciple? Like,
it's probably more akin to taking an AAU team and playing like in an inner city.
Okay.
Like,
yeah,
the refs aren't going to save you.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, this is going to be rough.
Yeah.
You're not going to be comfortable. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have to play tougher. You know, you're going to have to deal with things that you're not used to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's wind out here. There's sunlight. You're not in a perfect environment. And like putting them in a place where like they have to now perform.
Right. But calling Matthew is not about just Matthew. It's not like he was so amazing he had to be a disciple. It was like, it was an object lesson for the rest of
to practice, to practice what he's been preaching.
Yeah. I think they had to unlearn the things they had grown up knowing, those like truths that they didn't question as kids, that now through the beginning of Jesus's ministry, he starts like countering these and getting them to like change their thinking. And maybe it's not happening fast enough. Maybe they're not quite catching on. And he's like, no, I'm going to throw you in the deep end now.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Not only do you need to like love this person, but he's now on your team. Like you have to work with him.
I guess I always just thought Jesus wanted a financial guy. And so he was like, you know, I need.
Well, the treasurer was Judas. So he was just thinking further in the future.
He needs someone that's really familiar with like Roman tax code, basically. And, you know, okay.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, I do think that we think like, you know, or at least they were for sure thinking like, this guy, this is the most unlikely person. And that's the self-righteous way of thinking. Everyone is the most unlikely person.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's, you know, some people's sin is on the outside and some people's sin is on the inside, but all of us are sin, you know, have sin, and all of us come to the table as an unlikely disciple. And I think that's the thing that is always reminding us of, in this story, it's always sort of reminding us of where we start out, is that you got sin and somebody else has it. Theirs might be more visible. Yours might be less visible. It doesn't make you better than them. You're an unlikely disciple. They're an unlikely disciple. All of us are only good because of the grace of Christ, like the mercy that God shows us through Jesus. Like that's the main, one of the main takeaways, obviously. And so when you say like at the end of the bench, like there isn't anything that makes him at the end of the bench except for the other 5 players not really wanting to play with him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So Matthew, his sort of superpower in this moment is just his like perfect obedience. Jesus says, come and follow me. He does not make up an excuse. He does not ask questions. He does not, you know, there's no nuance that he needs to understand. He just gets up and goes. He leaves the community of people that he knows, the financial security of the position he has, the protection of the Roman, you know, of the Roman guard, which the tax collectors would have had their protection like 24/7 because they were basically, you know, I mean, that would have been, you would have been a target.
Yeah.
And so just gets up and goes. Now, again, how familiar he was with Jesus, we don't really know. He probably knew who Jesus was because Jesus had been working in Galilee. There's even a church tradition that he might have been the brother of one of the disciples, one of the other ones. We don't really know. It's not really like listed in there. There's 2 people from a similar hometown that you can almost make the case. But either way, what's important about this is that his obedience was exactly what Jesus asked, exactly when he asked, without any of the other issues, right? So, hang on. I just want to make sure I did something right here. I think I forgot to mute you guys. There we go. That'll be better audio. So to me, that is the main thing. And then you have the conversation about the fact that now when new disciples come into the kingdom, new groups of people that can be reached are now those kind of open up.
Mm-hmm.
So like who Matthew knew and who he was connected to and who he could get into a room to be with Jesus was a group of people that were very, very far from Jesus. And it turns out Jesus is very interested in reaching them.
Mm-hmm.
You have this juxtaposition here where Jesus is also interested in a weird way of reaching the religious people,
Mm-hmm.
because he is always calling them out and challenging them. And I think we just get into this mindset that he was just like in this adversarial role with the Pharisees and stuff, and like he was always, taking the fight to them and pushing on them and whatever. But I always think like he was doing that, challenging them outwardly in a way to reach them.
Yeah, Jesus wasn't a brawler in the sense that like he was looking for a fight every time. It was like, so many, pretty much all of like the biblical stories, the encounters with Jesus, the different people he interacts with, like there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that needed healing, and he didn't heal all of them.
Nope.
He specifically picked instances and situations where there was an audience, so people could see it, whether it was the disciples or whether it was the people around them or whether it was the Pharisees. Like these were moments to try and make a point, to teach, to, it was the tool he was using to like implement this new vision of what grace was going to be like.
Yeah.
So,
and there were some Pharisees who were following Jesus by the time that he went to the cross,
mm-hmm.
and were following him after.
Mm-hmm.
So like he did reach some, I think after he goes to the cross, he's collected by two richer disciples, one of which is a Pharisee. Like they collect his body and bring him to a tomb, and the tomb belongs to Joseph of Arimathea. He's a
mm-hmm.
kind of a rich disciple. The other person that's with him is a Pharisee. Like, so
mm-hmm.
he did reach people who are in this religious elite class, but he did it through not, it is definitely a form of grace to be able to call them out and challenge them in the way that he did. But like, it's
mm-hmm.
definitely not the way that he reached tax collectors and sinners. That kind of grace was like, dignity of humanity that he gave them, even though they didn't feel it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
right.
So it's like the prostitute shows up and he treats her like a person who deserves dignity, as opposed to calling out her sin. But with the religious people, he projects strength only with them, like calling out their hypocritical nature and challenging them. But I always go back and go, what's he doing here? He's calling this out so everybody else can see how wrong this is. But in a way, he's like kind of tearing them down to be able to try to reach some of them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he's not going to be very successful because religious, sort of self-righteous people are very hard to reach. I think we've learned that over however long the church
isn't that
existed.
kind of the nature of self-righteousness? Like, makes you very hard to reach.
Yes. But there are some, religious people in that day who had found their way into the Pharisees, who were sensitive to God's leading and the Holy Spirit, and were open to what Jesus was saying and doing. We don't really get all those stories, but my guess is there was a lot more than you think.
Yeah. Do you think in general people misidentify who they are in this story? Meaning that I think typically when we read this story, we think of ourselves, and I mean Christians, like we're the other disciples, right? And that we're maybe missing the opportunity to bring in a Matthew because of Matthew's sin or his undesirableness. I'm almost the opposite. I'm almost like, I feel like we're Matthew. you know, like
that's, I think, the point.
Yeah.
Significantly.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I know why I can't turn you up. I'm messing with the wrong one. Let's try that.
I was like,
you're not.
It's going all over the place.
There we go.
Yeah.
We're going to get there one of these days. Don't worry.
Yeah. Imperfect church for imperfect people and imperfect podcasts.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I think like what we need to remember as we talk about this is that like, you use the phrases in the message on Sunday talking about, we're not guilty by association when we're around sinners, air quote.
Right.
But we're also not guilty by association, or we're not saved by association as well.
Right.
Like if that's the approach that you take, if that's the context of this story, then you can be like, well, yeah, I'm Matthew.
I thought more about that because it actually like it came off a little different than I'd hoped. we are saved by association, but
Mhm.
not with the association we have with other believers.
Mm.
Right.
Right.
Meaning, like,
Sure.
Whereas
Yeah.
if you just go through the motions and come to church, a lot of people think that's enough. I'm a Christian.
But we're saved by association with Christ,
Right.
Yes.
and not saved by association with our family or
Yeah.
other believers
This
or
is
good
not
people.
genetic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we are for sure that guilty by association is never a thing.
No.
Right. Which is really interesting. I know I don't know if I've shared, I think I've shared this story. Like I people who have been around long enough, know me long enough, probably heard every story I got, but and those of you who are new, this will be new for you.
So watch out.
But like as a youth pastor,
If there's kids listening, earmuffs.
I had a friend, actually still goes to the church, still practices this, who would reach out to all of his buddies and he would host like a poker night at his house. And he's just the kind of guy who just like has all these friends who are, like rough, like, guys in their 20s and early 30s who, just, like tradesmen, like language wise, like the kind of guys that would come to a poker night. And
Yeah.
he would always invite me. And I was like, I stuck out like a sore thumb, because I'm not getting wasted. I'm not, not overly crazy with how I'm talking. Like I'm just, not swearing so much or whatever.
Would you like put on a like high vis, like neon green or yellow shirt and pretend like you're a
No, I thought I
construction-
should wear a collar. Yeah.
Oh.
like, and so like I would go and hang out, and I'd just be hanging out with guys playing poker, and like halfway through, it would get to the point where people were starting to get to know each other a little bit, and somebody would ask, "What do you do?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm a youth pastor," and they'd be like, "This one was like a record stopped," like. And I remember this one guy for sure. He was like, "Dude, I am so effing sorry." He didn't say F,
Yeah.
he said the whole, and he's like, "I've been just cussing in front of you all night," like all of a sudden he had to change his behavior because there's a pastor in the room.
Mm-hmm.
But like I always took it as a compliment that they had no idea that I was a pastor. Like I was just sort of infiltrating, what I
Right.
mean, this world. And my friend he's a believer, strong believer, like he kept relationship with all these guys on purpose. Like his deal was, I want to keep these guys close, and I want to be there when they need somebody, and I want to help them potentially know Jesus through our relationship. And so this was one way for him to be able to do that. And it feels weird because you're going into a place where there's like probably a lot of drinking and a lot of, like unhealthy or, conversations that are not maybe like perfectly clean for Christians to be in. And maybe a lot of people would be like, yeah, I can't go into that room. I don't want to be guilty by association. But you just have to figure out how to be a normal person in places like that, So I think that's what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples. Like, hey, we're going to call the unlikely disciple, and now we're going to go and reach all of his friends.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so figure it out. And, there is no section of that story where the disciples are complaining, but it's almost like they left that part out. Like, that happened.
They are the ones who wrote the books.
Well, Matthew wrote Matthew.
Yeah.
Which is funny. Like, Matthew doesn't even say it was his house, but we get it in the other one. Matthew's just kind of like, yeah.
Well, he probably left it out because he's trying to get in with good with those guys.
He
He
doesn't
doesn't
wanna
want to like
call
throw
them
them
out.
under the bus.
These were written after, like, it's, yeah. But to me, it's like, I know there was a conversation. Jesus, are you sure about this? Do you know what we're doing here? Like, I get it. Like, you want everyone to feel like they're part of the team, and you want, people to be, and like, that's okay. We can accept Matthew if he'll change.
Yeah.
But
or like the conversations about how is this going to hurt your ministry? I mean, we've had those in the church. Like, if you associate with these people, if you do those things, that's going to hurt your ministry, and you're not going to be able to reach these other people. And Jesus says, nope, you're wrong. I don't care.
And those are the moments that break my heart the most, where you lose somebody in your church because they can't fathom how you can be giving grace to somebody who's coming to your church, and you're just like, I feel like when we feel this tension, we're doing it right. Like, I don't feel 100% comfortable with how this is going, but that's probably where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I think grace is one of those things that if you do it right,
it hurts.
It's rough.
Yeah.
It's tough. Yeah.
There's a cost.
And, I think we had this conversation last week just in private, but it was the notion of just the nature of grace. Like if you're feeling pretty comfortable, you're probably doing something, or you're not doing something you should be doing. Like these things that we're talking about are not easy. They're not always fun.
Right.
Like it can be stressful or anxious, it's tough. And not just for like us or you, but like it can be tough for the people around us. Like, you were just saying that when you lose someone from your church because they don't like that you're reaching out to this person who they don't want you to reach out to.
That absolutely has happened.
Yeah.
Right. That's not a fake story. That multiple people, I probably have like, I could go back and recount 5 times in the history of our church where someone was like, this person has to go. And I was like, that's not going to happen. And then they left.
Mhm.
Right. So I just think it's like, not that we should always be uncomfortable, but if you're just be like, yeah, life's easy. This is grace things. Cake.
Not if you do it right.
Yeah.
Not if you're doing it right. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
So, the story to me, it presents the heart that Jesus has for people who are like down and out, far from him, who are outcasts, the edges of society, maybe don't have community. And it it challenges me to think about what group of people would Jesus be hanging out with that I would be uncomfortable going with him to be involved in reaching. Because that's really what happened here to the disciples. Like, pick the worst group that they didn't want to be with, and Jesus took them right to those people. I kind of feel like he wanting to reach people and not feeling the guilt by association thing would take us as believers into places that, like, we would want to avoid. You know what I mean? So, I do think there's a bit of comfort in our, in our decisions to associate with certain people or not. And I think this shows itself the most in the amount that believers interact with non-believers, or the way that believers interact with people who disagree with them in certain areas.
Well, I take it one step farther. I think that used to be the case, years ago. It was like a believers versus non-believers conversation. Now it's digressed to a point of like believers versus other types of believers, or a believer who is believes in the other, political party that I'm in, or something like that. Like we have downgraded the standards so much for a variety of reasons that like the undesirable people are people within the same kingdom as us. Like, and I think that's one of the really hard parts about this conversation too, is that Matthew is not always like our enemy. Sometimes it's our neighbor. It's someone in our small group. It's like, your brother or sister, literally, like your parent. It can be as nuanced as that, but I think it makes it that much more important of a message. Like, what are we doing? Like, we're being that stingy with grace that we can't even like share it with another Christian, another Christ follower. Like, yeah. So,
yeah, I've been reading Not In It to Win It by Andy Stanley. And it's kind of a book that's really positioned for pastors. Like, I would recommend it to somebody who really cares about politics and how it should affect the church and how it should affect a regular believer. And he asks some really tough questions and pushes really like the buttons that, I mean, my heart was like, is, amening all the way throughout this book. Cause I've seen the sort of entrenchment that happens on both sides of this conversation about believers and what they believe in politics. And, it strikes me as odd that, I've actually heard this a couple times on clips of pastors talking about politics, and they'd say something to the effect of, especially with the Roe versus Wade and the abortion conversation that's been happening lately. A couple pastors that are kind of famous have had clips pulled out of their sermons and sort of circulated on social media. And this one pastor was basically saying, hey, if you're a Democrat, we need to start using church discipline and essentially start a conversation about whether you can possibly believe in Jesus and be a Democrat.
Yeah. So this is a pastor talking to other Christians.
His church.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm like, I just I don't even know where to go with this conversation. It's like it's so crazy, it's so ridiculous, And Andy Stanley is calling this out, and he's basically saying, "Hey, I don't know if you're aware of this, but like over 90% of Black Christians, African American Christians in our country, are Democrat. Like, and there's like a high percentage of sort of." I guess white Christians that would be considered conservative or Republican. And he's like, have you really thought about what you're saying? Like, you would essentially be cutting off like 50% of the church and almost all African Americans and saying like, these people,
you're not a Christian,
don't belong to Jesus. And I'm like, I don't know where to go with all this. Like, it keeps, just when you think it's the most ridiculous it can be, it goes up a level. Like, almost like, that, well, I think this is kind of what it is. It's like the idolatry of politics. It continues to divide the church in such a way that I think people have made politics their God and not allowed Jesus to be. I think you'll find it in sometimes people will say something, well, I'm a conservative Christian. I'm a Republican Christian. I'm a Democrat Christian.
Yep.
And it's like when you have
there should be no qualifier.
You have an adjective before I believe in Jesus. I follow Christ. Yep. I'm obedient to him. I just can't. I don't know what to do with that. It's like what world do we live in here that's what's, and you're talking about the people that are undesirable, the unlikely. Like, I would say, how many Christians have had non-Christians in their home in the past, I don't know, 6 months, a year? Now, some of that's COVID, which we'll talk about in a second, because that's part of why I preached this sermon this week. But how often do you interact with people who have different political persuasion than you? How often do you interact with somebody who's not the same race as you? Come on. Like, we are not comfortable with these other types of people, and we would rather continue to pour into ourselves people who agree with us and let them disciple us, and then continue to pull away from people who are different than us. And all we're doing when we do that is acting like these disciples who were perfectly happy reaching religious Jews who needed a little help getting a little bit better.
A little course correction.
Yeah. And they were not cool with reaching people who were their enemies, people who had different, ideas on how to, even the political persuasions, right? Because these are people who are tied in with the Roman government. They were not cool with reaching out to people who were too bad of sinners. There's some sort of line that they had created that, okay, they're too bad, we can't reach out to them. Yeah. And I read this and I'm just like,
they weren't even cool with reaching out to like Jews from a certain area of the same place, like let alone
forget
Gentiles.
About Samaritans,
right? Yeah,
half breeds, essentially.
Right.
So to me, that's the idea here, is that Jesus is going and trying to force the practice of the ideas onto his disciples, to push them in a way that makes the rubber meet the road. And I don't know if any of us are doing that, like, purposefully.
Yeah. And if you're not, and you're looking for help on how to do that, think of someone that you don't like and just go talk to them, right? Like your neighbor who doesn't mow their yard and their dog poops in yours, like, go talk to them.
Just somebody who believes something different than you.
Right.
Like,
yeah. I mean, as Christians, we have a ton of baggage. Like, a lot of us have trouble with immigrants, and a lot of us have trouble with Democrats, and a lot of us have trouble with people who are gay and homosexual and lesbian, and like we should be talking to people and showing them the love of Christ. And it's a struggles to do.
And so we naturally do this. Almost always, given to ourselves, we turn inward, away from things we don't want to be around and things we want to keep out of our lives.
Yep.
2, COVID allowed us to do this to a very high extreme, because we limited our circles.
Yeah.
And we kept just our family in our circle, just people that we were trying to protect or be around. Because of COVID, we were like limiting things, and that was appropriate, but it almost accelerated this idea that like we should turn inward. And I know that there was a culture war around this idea, or maybe is still, but that was like 80s and 90s. I felt it as a youth pastor, because you had like here's the caveat. I'm not throwing every homeschooler under the bus. I don't think everybody's like this, but the 80s and 90s, when I was kind of in youth group myself and then becoming a youth pastor, and then sort of like 2000s became a youth pastor, like there was a group of people in our church who were like Amish, where it was like, I'm going to protect my family at all costs from all the things in the world. That's going to mean I homeschool them. They only consume Christian media. None of the things of the world get in, and we're going to basically isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. But like, there's another version of that happening now, where you're kind of like, I don't think it's so overtly like culturally out there, but like, this is what people are doing. And it's in the name of protecting our children, or it's in the name of, you know, our own holiness, or it's in the name of, and they just basically
Christian heritage. Yeah.
You know, put themselves in a little, you know, fence off the rest of the world around them. And then essentially what they are is no good for outreach at all.
Yeah.
They never reach anyone. They don't interact with anyone. They don't like.
It's hard because I feel like sometimes it starts like at the very, very beginning, it starts with a good idea of like not consuming ungodly things, but then it's taken to the maximum extreme,
Right.
to where we're just going to like build our own fortresses and only be around our tiny little sliver version of Christianity,
right,
and have nothing else.
Right.
And there's nowhere in scripture where God calls us to that.
Yep.
Right.
He actually calls us to the opposite of that, to be a light for our communities. But yeah, like it starts not wrong. Like the initial thought of like, hey, I don't want my kids to consume this, or you know, take away temptation here,
Right,
whatever
yeah.
it is. It starts okay, and then we just go 1,000 miles an hour.
Right. And let's
headlong in.
acknowledge the fear of like, it's hard to raise kids as a Christian. Like the world is a scary place. Like you want to shield your kids from the slings and arrows of culture and of sin and all these different things. But, you know, at the same time, it's like you just said, Megan, I've read the Bible a lot, and it doesn't say to like isolate.
Yeah.
It says to like build bridges and not walls. Like it says to,
We're called to be in the world.
right. So I think, you know, to your point, Mark, like COVID really just accelerated this for a lot of people. There's a political cartoon that I saw like somewhere in the pandemic, and it was basically like, it was 2 frames, and like one frame was like all of the extroverts were like crying and so depressed because of COVID, and like all the introverts were like, yes, like finally my time has come. And it's like, maybe there's a number of Christians out there, like, because, you know, one of the results of COVID was like, I can build my walls a little bit higher. You know, I can isolate a little bit more. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, you touched on this, Megan. Like, I think this is a good point. I don't think a lot of people do this on purpose.
Yeah.
And I don't think it was like a nefarious.
No.
Right. They just got comfortable in it, or at first it was appropriate because you have to limit things because of COVID, and you wanted smaller communities, and you wanted smaller people that you're
so that you still could have some community. Like it was easier to pick 4 people,
right,
than to have nobody.
And these are people who have embraced their faith and are trying to do the best they can.
Yes.
And they're trying to do the best they can for their kids, like in their families and their, you know, faith communities.
But it just tends to snowball.
Right.
Like you make one decision
Yeah.
and another, and then it just they come quicker and they're easier to make, or maybe you don't just intentionally unmake them.
Yep.
And it just keeps rolling.
Well, and I know obviously a lot of people all on a big spectrum here, but some of the ones that are furthest along in this area, I've even seen, like, I had a conversation with one person who was like, yeah, we're going to change school systems. We're moving north. It's a lot more conservative up there. We're going to get more land. We're going to actually be in a smaller community where there's less people.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm just like having this conversation, like they are like bunkering. They're like settling down to raise their Christian family in a place that will, you know, I guess be less, I don't even know, more Christian or something is what the way they're looking at it. You're like, okay, but like your influence for Jesus here is now lost.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like there's not people up there that need Jesus. I'm sure there are, but your motivation to do that just seems so crazy to me, you know? So, I mean, again, and I know I'm all tons of people on the spectrum. So other people have thought the exact opposite way. So
Mhm.
it's good. But I think like people didn't intend for this.
Yeah.
And you know, it was one this book. Sorry, I'm gonna pull it up so I can actually make sure that I say it correctly. It's called Post Corona: From Crisis to Opportunity by Scott Galloway. Full disclosure, I have not read this, but the quote that was pulled out of it that I thought just hit me like a ton of bricks was just essentially around the idea that like COVID was an accelerant, and that basically in every way of society, every single movement of society or area, it accelerated things almost like 10 years. So in a lot of ways, it accelerated things in ways that like I use the illustration of like the tide goes out and it leaves things on the beach.
Mm.
And there was a lot of things left on the beach that we kind of had to pay attention to or look at about ourselves. I mean, the sermon series we did earlier this year about like hurry was all based on that was left on the
Yeah.
beach for me, looking at people's lives after COVID. Like I was like, we got to talk about this. I think what was left on the beach for a lot of people accidentally, hopefully, to like purposefully, was that we've kind of then turned in again.
Mhm.
And we can't be like that as a church. It's not our DNA.
Yep.
And we can't be like that as individuals. If there's not an element of your life where you're spending time praying for someone who's lost and reaching out to someone who's lost, you're missing the heart of God for the world around you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
You know, and if you're looking for principles on how to do this well, one of the things that I like to, as I talk to people about this, like pastoring wise, and you know, they're dealing with that tension, is like, look, I think we should be looking at our homes as like embassies, right?
Mhm.
That we're in a foreign land. This is not our home. This is not the place that we belong.
Yeah.
We should be like living differently within the world. But also when we retreat to our home, that's a place that's safe. That's a place that we recharge. That's a place where God is honored all the time in our homes. And we can still invite people into our homes. Like I sometimes think letting other people come into our home, have a meal with us, like be part of our lives, it shares our culture of serving Christ in such a better way than anything you could ever say.
Yeah.
You feel it. You walk into someone's house, you can feel
Yeah.
that. You know, there's like a different vibe to
Mhm.
the chaos of someone else's home, and you walk in and you're like, well, where is this peace coming from?
Mhm.
So to me, I do think that like you can think like that. You can say we build our kids here and we send them out. We pray here, and then we go out. Like we bring people in to feel and experience what's going on in our lives. We share the culture of following Christ in, you know, here in this home, and then we go out. Like there has to be a go out part of it, but I do think there needs to be like a home base part of it.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, so
Yeah.
I think like if you're looking for how do I do this, I would be like, well, one, start praying for somebody who's not a believer.
Yep.
Prayer moves your heart. I think a lot of people look at prayer and they think, what can I get out of God? Stop that idea.
Yep.
Understand that prayer moves.
That's a whole nother podcast. Yeah.
Moves your heart.
Yep.
If you want your heart to be feeling God's burden for lost people, you got to start praying for them for salvation and saying, God, use me. Like that's how you start moving towards having this, going away from the turning in and moving towards the turning out. By the way, if I was going to be fair to modern homeschoolers, which I think are a different breed than we had in the 90s and early 2000s.
I'd agree.
If I didn't already offend them and they shut it off, is the embassy idea is like important to them. And I think it's a great idea. Like but you still got to find ways to invite people into your life who aren't believers. And now you have to work way harder because your kids aren't every day going into a place where they're around non-believers.
You have to be more intentional.
Yes.
About finding those people.
Right. And I don't think there's anything wrong with creating safe spaces for your families, because I think so much of what we're talking about when it comes to that sense, like we're not railing on homeschoolers, it is really, maybe it's fear-based, but it's more about like protecting and nurturing like our kids and our families, right? And those are 100% wholesome, good things to do. But we shouldn't be doing them in ways that cause harm to our faith or hinder our ability to follow Jesus' example. I think that one of the biggest mistakes we make as Christians is we wait to evangelize people until they come to us. Right. Like we should be going to them. So,
and that was part of this conversation because those people at that party they weren't gonna come to the temple.
No,
They were
They weren't.
unclean. They weren't going to be
Yeah.
accepted at the temple.
they weren't invited.
But here they are in Matthew's house.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You don't realize how much influence you can have over people in your own home.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, and I think a lot of people are like, well, I just invite people to church and hopefully the pastor preaches a good enough message that someone gets their
Yeah.
life changed. It's like, that's so rare. if
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
preach a message that reaches someone, it's probably because you've already laid the groundwork, have the relationship,
Right.
have
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like all I did was just push the person over.
Yeah.
Like they were already
Yeah.
ready.
And maybe you're listening to this podcast or this conversation and you're like, oh, I talk to my coworkers. I do that. And
Yeah.
it's like, great. That's awesome. Do more.
Go get lunch. Yeah. Get
Right.
coffee.
Yeah.
I loved your emphasis on Sunday to do this in order to have a relationship with people, not so that they get saved. Like Jesus calls us to love people
Yeah. You can't
and
just
be in relationship with them.
Yeah.
And if salvation comes, fantastic.
Yep.
Throw a party. If not,
Mhm.
that's okay. And those people are still worth investing in and having a relationship with.
Right.
But
Yeah.
you can't just like have some baseline relationship just to evangelize to them or just to do that. Like Jess and I were involved with a college ministry when we were in college, and it was all about like evangelism. We had tracks, all that stuff. And I think back and cringe, you know, there were people who I'm sure found Jesus and it's great, but like, my goodness, like it would have just been so much better to like go out and meet people,
Yeah.
start conversations, and then like let those be vehicles through that relationship, through actually genuinely caring about people to
I mean,
then share.
We've
grace
all
and
been on the end
Jesus.
of that like sales call where it's like the only reason you want to take me to coffee is to sign me up for some financial account or whatever.
Right.
Like
Right.
I don't need that. I don't need you to buy me coffee.
Yeah.
I don't want that. Like you want to buy me coffee just because you want to see how I'm doing. Like I have a friend that every couple months just reaches out and is like, "Hey, how's it going? Let's have coffee. Let's touch base." He's a realtor. He knows I'm in no place to buy a house or not looking to at all. Just wants to touch base and have a relationship and see where I'm at. Yeah, don't be salesy. Don't
Yeah.
try and work people.
I had a guy, camp representative who's in Twin Cities a couple weeks ago, and he like texted me, "Hey, I'm in your area. You want to have lunch?" And I'm like, "Sure." And I made sure to the entire time. He's a brand new dad, so he's like a younger guy, like a baby, like a 2-year-old.
Mhm.
And I was like, the entire time, I basically talked to him about being a dad, and asked him how his wife was doing, talked to him about his family, like
Mhm.
shared with what it's been like during COVID as a pastor, like spent the entire time talking ministry, and made sure that I bought the lunch because I was like, I care about you and I want to be in a
Yeah.
relationship with you. I'm not in this for the relationship I have with your camp that you're
Yeah.
representing.
Mhm.
I just wanted to touch back on the relationship piece of it, because it's people feel that
Mhm.
they
Mhm.
know whether you genuinely care about them or you are trying to get something from them. And I don't know, a couple of years ago when I was training my youth leaders, we read this book, and basically the idea of the book was this point, the idea that like the relationship is worth itself, like worth enough in itself to have it.
Mhm.
And whether or not the person does what I hope they will do,
Mhm.
whether they respond to Jesus in the way that I want them to respond to Jesus, is not the reason for the relationship. Okay.
Mhm.
Because students especially
Mhm.
smell that.
Oh, 100%.
Gen Z, millennial, they're so good
Yeah.
on the BS meter.
Yeah.
Mhm.
They're generally like, you don't actually care about me and you're trying to get something out of me.
Yep.
And when I presented this idea and we read this book, and I was training all the leaders to basically say, like, look, these relationships need to be authentic because these kids will see right through it. If
Mhm.
all you're doing is trying to control them into a relationship with Jesus, you'll
Yeah.
actually do the opposite of what you're hoping to do.
Yep.
And I had this one leader, and he was like, why are we even talking about this? Like, if they don't accept Jesus, then we have failed as, youth leaders. And I was like, but don't you understand that you have that's the reason you're doing this,
Mhm.
then it will go completely in the opposite direction on
Yeah.
you. Like, they will definitely, like, control is never Coercion is never the right way to get what you're hoping out of this person. Now, does it mean that I care about their salvation? Absolutely. Do I pray for their salvation? Absolutely. But you know how many students I'm still connected with, even now, who aren't Christians, who
Yeah.
didn't accept Jesus, who went all the way through the youth ministry. And you know what they do? They
Mhm.
still reach out in
Yeah.
times when they need some help or need a hand.
Mhm.
And I still get a chance to
Yes.
speak gospel truth into their lives.
100%.
And only reason that I still have that opportunity is because they trusted the relationship in the first place.
Mhm.
So I do think there's got to be a,
Mhm.
Yeah.
you know, you got to really be in it for the person,
Yep.
for the relationship,
Yeah. 100%.
you know. And I just don't do, I don't do coercion. I don't do
No.
control. I just won't do it.
Well, and the reality is, if that's the method you're using, if the person you're talking to ever has a point where they like maybe a little crack has opened and they have questions, you're probably not the person they're going to go to, because they
Mhm.
don't want to be controlled. They don't want to like just enter that conversation with you because they're probably exhausted with having that conversation 10 times over.
Right.
They're going to go to a safe person who actually cares about them.
Yep.
So just be that person. Just
Yeah. Build trust.
Yeah.
Well, and just Jesus didn't come to manipulate the world.
No.
Like he came to
He-
seek and save the lost.
he could have snapped his fingers and had everybody bow.
Right.
He didn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that concept that Jesus is a gentleman, you know, he's never forcing himself on you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of the concept for this sermon, and just I just want to push people to be thinking outwardly again.
Yeah.
So I mean, the challenge was just to be praying for someone and to be creating a relationship with somebody who's not a believer.
Yeah.
Maybe, oh my goodness, maybe someone who's a Democrat or a Republican. I don't know. Maybe somebody who's, you know, not the same race as you. Like, just get outside of your comfort zone. But then it does lead us to a larger conversation, which I think is interesting, at least, is that like what things were left on the beach for you when COVID came and went? What did you see kind of in yourself that you didn't like, or you did like, things that you leaned into that you wanted to kind of increase, and other things you wanted to decrease, things you wanted to fix and change and grow in? I think there are a lot of conversations around that. And so I don't know, just interested in your guys' thoughts. Like, what else is on the beach for the church, for yourself, for small groups, for people in general? Like, what did you notice? What things are you thinking about when you hear that question?
Yeah.
I think for me, personally, it really emphasized the importance of relationships. And, you know, we've talked about this in so many ways, but like, as someone who's been in youth ministry for so long, I mean, that was kind of a no-brainer. I never really had to think critically about it, though. It just was always there.
Mhm.
You know, it was not something that like I ever imagined could be taken away. And so now that we understand how important it is, that it's like the best vehicle through which we can deliver the gospel to people, then we need to figure out, like, because, you know, it seems like COVID is almost over. Maybe it's never going to be over. It'll be in some form. Like, we just need to figure out how to help people understand that too, I think, is one thing. I think another thing, just for the church in general, for Christians in general, is that phrase that we talked about earlier, you know, faith by association, I think is a big thing that a lot of people are being confronted with, in the sense that like they can, in the past, just go through the motions of being a church. And that was what made them a Christian. But when that gets taken away, it creates this crucible of identity. Like, who actually am I? What do I actually believe? Do I have a faith? Like, is that all my faith was? You know, so it's like, and I think that this deconstruction movement has been born out of that, where people are now questioning and they're afraid that their faith isn't skeletal or something, and they
Accelerated?
have to. Right.
Yeah, not born of.
Yeah.
I think it was happening already, but accelerated.
Right.
Significantly.
Right. That's a better way of saying it. But it's like people are really thrust into that now. And, you know, so it makes me think like, all right, how is the church serving those people? Besides trying to get them back in the door, how are we actually serving them to help them find their faith again and make it meaningful? So I think those are kind of probably the big things that I see. So
yeah, I had somebody tell me, you know, during COVID, like, I just started going to brunch or just having brunch instead of going to church. And
It's pretty great.
Kind of liked it. And then I had somebody else tell me, this is the funny one. I'm like, man, people are just real. They're just gonna tell you like what's really happening.
Yeah.
One guy goes like, no, I really like sports and wake up and I like gambling. So I just get up in the morning and I just like play some bets and get ready for the games that are coming on. And yeah, I kind of don't miss church at all. I don't think I'm gonna come back. And I was like, oh, well, okay. Like,
Thank you for your honesty.
how do your kids feel about that?
Yeah.
Do you hope they are going to be
Yeah.
Christians?
Mhm.
Like, I was like, so I do think, you know, I think when people lost the community of it and lost the rhythm of doing the Sunday morning thing, what was left was a very vulnerable, weak faith that really didn't amount to much.
Mhm.
It really wasn't personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In both of those situations with those two individuals, I just question whether or not their faith was really all that strong.
Mhm.
Like they were basically only going to follow Jesus in a community of people that were
Also,
pushing on them.
Mhm.
Yeah. Encouraging them.
yeah.
So
One thing that I noticed, and we had many conversations about this way back when, we didn't live stream services. We specifically decided not to, so that it didn't give people an excuse to stay home and watch church from their couch.
I'm sure the words came out of my mouth. I will never live stream services.
I remember having conversations with other church planners,
100%.
like trying to like defend this stance.
Yeah.
And God is up there going, oh yeah.
Never say never. And then COVID hit, and we had to. We had no other option. It was that or not have church for who knows how long. But then I remember about 6 months into COVID, one of these pastors that I had talked to about why we didn't want to live stream, I don't know, I can't remember if we must have started meeting again in person. But he was like, I get it now. We've created this consumeristic culture, and now nobody wants to come back to church because they're all sitting at home on their dining room table.
It was pure vindication. I'm gonna be honest with you.
It
I
felt
was like,
great.
I was like, oh really? What happened was
Now you get it.
exactly what we thought was
Yeah.
gonna happen.
But I've noticed this just with us as humans in general. I mean, how fast did all of the stores switch to like
Mhm.
drive up,
Unbelievable.
like curbside? And if you couldn't get it in 2 hours and
died.
have somebody bring it out to your car, then you're just not shopping there.
Yeah, your store just went straight.
They've just lost your
into the
business.
trash can.
Yeah.
And we're talking about how Target literally
Yeah.
redesigned their stores
Yep.
to now have a complete area for drive up that's
Yeah.
off of the main.
The one here in Shoreview, they
Yeah.
added a big thing on the side, and it's curbside pickup only. And
Have you been in there? It's like they created a whole spot.
I haven't seen the inside of it.
Oh yeah,
but
I wanted to pick
I
something up the
only
other
do
day.
drive up.
I'm bitter because I still like to go into stores, and so I'm apparently a second class citizen.
Which is
now,
fun.
so-
Second class.
Yeah.
Get out of here.
But I mean, even now, as COVID is starting to get better and people are back in stores, I mean, I've heard that Target is going to start doing returns through curbside. Not because people can't come in the store, just because people really like staying in their cars.
Right.
Starbucks is going to start delivering curbside at Targets.
Yep.
So you can just pick up an
think
order,
they should
return
have, like,
something.
Pop a shot. Like, so you drive by and just like 3-point shoot your bag into the return basket. It's sweet.
And it's like part of me sees the benefit of this. I think of a young mom who doesn't want to like get her sleeping baby out of the car,
That's a
Mhm.
real
can just
thing.
like pull up, get diapers or milk or whatever it is, and then just go home.
Mhm.
Like, I get that. But I also have realized that I'm super lazy. And if I have an option for curbside and I don't have to go into the store, fantastic. But then who am I actually seeing? Like, who am I interacting with in life? This has been some of my
Yeah.
like, I now talk to 4 people. One of them's my roommate. Like, where are the other people in my life?
The tight circle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and as somebody who's like generally on one leg, I'm down. You know,
Right.
you bring it out to
Like,
me, like you made my life way
great.
better. But I do think in that conversation is this idea that like, man, if we don't keep adapting, that for me was a takeaway for the church.
Mhm.
Was that like I need to be willing to build the pickup parking lot on the side of the building.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that I'm not going to do what we did traditionally,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
I got to find ways to, and you know, maybe that wasn't the right idea. It's like, we're never going to do this. It's probably never the right idea.
Yeah.
Like to say, I'm going to adapt in every way I need to adapt.
Yep.
If there's another opportunity to reach people, I'm going to try.
Mhm.
I do think we were right on the
Yeah.
live stream. It's good for people who are like sick or away.
Yep.
Mhm.
You know, I've had people tell me, "Hey, we're at the cabin. We pull up church and did it," and that's great. And you know, I think it's a little bit over like blown because I look at the numbers and I'm kind of like, there's like 4 people on. Like, so
Yeah.
you're acting like you did this, but I don't actually think that's what happened. You were one of the 4. You know, but so to me, like I do think there's that we probably were onto something, that we knew that the type of disciple that you'd have through a video screen is not the kind we want to create.
Yeah.
But also I need to be willing to like change or adapt or die.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of churches, they died, and then other churches figured it out and they figured out how to get through everything.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know, going back and forth on it, like I feel like I can apply that idea of adapting in any way possible. And that's a good part about being a 3-year-old church.
Yeah.
A mobile church.
There's not a long precedent of what we've
change
done
tomorrow.
historically.
Yeah, we can change tomorrow.
And we're pretty nimble. So
Yeah.
you know.
But I think it's also helped people realize that we do need community.
Mhm.
Like you need people.
Yep.
Almost like it's in the Bible or something.
Almost as if that was
like
the whole
designed
point
that way or
all along. And I look at the values that we wrote down pre-COVID when we launched the church and how much, you know, we're all about community and all about the community. That became even more important through COVID.
Both of those things.
Yeah.
Yep.
And just how much the community needs us.
Right.
And we have to actually be present and
imperfect church for imperfect people.
Yeah.
You know, like gospel is good news for all.
Yeah.
I mean, I just feel like, I mean, that's a nice thing to go, okay, our DNA, our values hold up. You can completely change the whole world and they're still valid. They're still important.
Yeah.
That to me was a nice outcome of realizing, okay, we do have, these aren't necessarily a traditional way of saying things, or we have certain language around them, but like these ideas, they will hold. Doesn't really matter what's going on around us.
Yeah. We're a small church. We make weird decisions sometimes. Like we do weird things. I'm okay with that. We hired 3 staff through COVID where other churches were on complete budget freezes. It's almost as if God was in control and knew it was happening way before we did.
Yeah. Yeah, I talked to one church that their budget went down 50% during COVID. Oh.
Like,
Mark, what was left on your beach? Or on the beach that you were walking on?
No, I think to me the biggest thing was, you know, and so this is just me putting on my pastor's hat. This isn't really personal as much as something I saw in culture, is that I think a lot of people leaned into hobbies, vices, sin, entertainment. There were things that I think they leaned into things that kept them busy, active, or served themselves or medicated themselves. You know, I know a lot of people that drank a little too much during COVID. I know people that like went all in on their crazy hobby, whatever it was. I know people that, I mean, I was kind of one of those people too, could be perfectly honest, but I think there were, and entertainment. And I think a lot of it was keep myself busy. Now that life isn't keeping me busy, there's like this low level, there's this low level disillusionment with life that's just kind of eating away at me. Like this buzz below the surface that's just like, I don't feel comfortable. And so in order to deal with that, what I'm going to do is either medicate or keep myself busy or do something productive or do something that's unproductive, like just so I don't have to deal with this like low level disillusionment with the world, this like unhealthy, this feeling of being out of control, this like I'm not okay kind of feeling. And we saw the opposite happen too. A lot of people became depressed, became anxious, because that just sort of, there wasn't enough to keep them busy enough to keep that from being felt.
Well, and I think too, some of that was already there. There wasn't just enough distraction in our lives with having to do 1,000 things, that when you take all that away, you take work away, you take school away, all of that busyness then you just have to deal with you. Like life is
Yes.
quiet for a little bit. And I think a lot of people didn't like what they were left with.
Oh, no,
Correct.
not at all.
Like,
That's a very scary
yeah.
place for a lot of people.
And they were having existential crises,
Mhm.
essentially, and trying to either medicate their way out of
Yeah.
it or keep
Or
themselves
just
busy.
numb.
Or
Whether
numb it.
it's
Yep.
Netflix
Or entertain themselves.
or sourdough bread or whatever it is. Like,
the second one was oddly specific.
It's
well,
like
that was one of those
started
crazes.
baking, yeah.
Doing
Oh,
the sourdough
gotcha.
starters.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Sorry, no, that wasn't
No,
like
I
a
was
call
working-
out to someone.
We're, the one that I always thought was funny was like the person's like, hey, I'm looking for a new series to watch. Here's the list of things I've watched. And it's like, no joke, 150 shows deep.
Yeah.
Where they watched every single episode of 150
How many hours
shows.
did you spend watching Netflix every day?
Dude,
Like,
I was like, at one point I was like, you watched every single episode of this piece of crap. Like, like, are you kidding me? There's nothing left for you. You've reached
Yeah.
the end, and now you have to deal
how
with
many
yourself.
hours have you spent reading your Bible?
I wasn't even thinking it from that perspective, but that's a good way to look at it. So yeah, to me, just that existential crisis that people kind of went through that led to depression, led to anxiety, led to them medicating, led to them, keeping themselves busy or entertaining. Like, man, I just wish that people would understand that is there so that you will be uncomfortable until you find Jesus.
Yeah. Nothing in this world will fill that hole.
No. I know that's kind of cliche.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's real.
Mhm.
That existential crisis doesn't get solved in any other way. We spent all of COVID throwing everything at it we could.
Mhm.
And it doesn't even get solved by having great community.
Yeah.
Like, if you stop long enough to feel that, it's always going to
Mhm.
be there unless you know Christ. So that was the thing left on the beach for me.
Mhm.
A lot of people, they didn't handle that well,
Yeah.
and now they're, wishing they had done differently.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, guys, I think that kind of wraps it up, unless there's any other thoughts. As always, we really want your guys' questions and comments in the feedback section and the comment section. So if there's any topics, anything you want to talk about, any questions you have, be sure to throw those in there. You can also reach out to us at office@pursuitcommunity.church. You can email, or if you're at church on a Sunday, you can talk to any of us. We would love to hear from you all, because we're doing this for you guys too.
I just
yeah.
wanted to throw in there, if anybody wanted to read ahead to the story we're going to do this weekend, we're going to be talking about the woman at the well in John chapter 4.
No, not this weekend.
We changed that.
That's incorrect.
Hold on. I'll get it. I have it here.
It'll be Jesus and someone.
We moved that one to
We did.
June 26th.
Yeah.
We have a special guest
Um,
speaker doing that one.
This week, we are
I can't remember when we moved up. I should have looked at it already.
Jesus thins the crowd.
Yes.
We're looking at John chapter 6,
Mm.
verses 60 through 70.
Ooh. Get ready to throw up.
So this is gonna be an intense one, but it'll be really good.
This is where Jesus has like a party of people following him and getting free food.
Yeah.
And then just the crowds keep coming, and he basically gets up in front of everyone and goes,
Be gone.
he goes, hey, eat my body and drink my blood. And they're all like, oh.
So sorry, what?
That took a turn,
Mhm.
and they all abandoned him. The next line says something to the effect of, that day all the crowds turned and left, and whatever. And then the disciples come to him and they're like, Jesus,
Do you really?
why
want
did you
us to
do that?
Yeah.
This was going so well.
Yeah.
We were going to march into Jerusalem with an army of people behind us, and it was going to be overwhelming, and we were going to win.
Mhm.
And he was like, no. Discipleship means obedience, even when it's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Right.
good. Get ready. So get ready.
Yes. John chapter 6, verses 60 through 70.
Awesome.
Cool.
We love you guys and hope you have a great week.
Yeah. Have a
We'll
good
talk
one.
to you soon.